Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but I'm really delighted to know about the conference and congratulate the organisers on doing a great job with the meeting. I'm going to briefly outline some of the challenges to health and development in the Anthropocene epoch. Well, what is the Anthropocene epoch? You may be asking yourself. It's really summarized in this slide, which shows you on the left how we've seen dramatic changes in human well-being, improvements in gross domestic product, economic growth, in human health. Human life expectancy has increased by a quarter of a century over since the middle of the last century, something of that order. We've seen dramatic declines in infant mortality in many parts of the world, declines in maternal mortality as well. And the number of people living in absolute poverty has also declined. Of course, there are still inequalities. And that has been driven really by the exploitation of the environment. So in order to grow the food, to produce the energy that we need to develop, to sustain the economic growth that we see on this slide, we've had to exploit the environment. So the cost has been borne by Earth systems. And that's shown on the right side of this slide. You can see there's been major declines in biodiversity, increases in the use of land to grow food, and we've probably reached the limits of that. We've seen accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, for example, which is a long-lived greenhouse gas. 20% of it stays in the atmosphere for over 1,000 years. That's at a level which has not been experienced on the planet for at least 800,000 years. So we are seeing very major and dramatic changes in Earth systems, which have really underpinned and been the result of these economic changes and changes in development and health that are also shown on this slide. And this has been given the term the Great Acceleration, because you can see that there's been an acceleration since the middle of the last century, both in development, but in the way in which we're exploiting the environment. So in the Lancet Rockefeller Commission that I chaired a few years ago, we came to the conclusion that there had indeed been dramatic advances in human development, but these had come at a cost, and the damage to natural systems may undermine these advances in health in the future. So this slide shows you two future scenarios. The bottom one is if we can remain below 2 degrees, which is what was agreed at Paris, the Paris climate change negotiations. And the upper line is what happens if we just continue business as usual. And that shows you that we could be at 4 degrees warming compared to pre-industrial times by the end of the century. Well, in reality, we're somewhere between these two lines. So if all the commitments that were made in Paris are implemented, then we're heading for about 3, perhaps 3.2 degrees higher temperature by the end of the century than at pre-industrial times. And that will have major, major implications for human health. I'm not going to go into them in detail, but some of them are summarized on this slide. On the left, you see the range of environmental changes: climate change, biodiversity loss, freshwater depletion and contamination, overfishing of the oceans and acidification because of carbon dioxide dissolving in the oceans. Carbon dioxide is also fertilizing crops, changing the nutrient composition. Land use change and soil degradation. We're losing soil in many parts of the world. And of course, urbanization, the increase in population growth, is largely in cities. And that will have a range of effects on human health. There's the direct effects, for example, for climate change, heat and extreme events. The ecosystem-mediated effects, so for example, emerging infectious diseases as a result of land use changes, changes in agriculture, for example, or changes in climate. And these can affect food supply and cause increases in undernutrition. And finally, what we might call the socially mediated effects. So they're mediated through the effects on social systems, socio-economic systems, increased poverty, perhaps migration and conflict. We also know that many of these global environmental changes are linked to some of the environmental effects that we're very familiar with. for example, air quality, air pollution. And we're now recognizing that air pollution is a major killer, causes about 1 in 9 deaths globally, may even be more than that according to recent estimates. A major killer, of course, are fine particulates. These fine particulates come largely from energy use, in generating energy for industry, for household use, and for transport. And of course the agricultural system as well is a major cause of air pollution. So there are links then between the environmental threats that are very familiar to us from our day-to-day living and these global environmental changes, because many of them are being driven by the way in which we use energy and we're transforming land to grow food and other crops. So this slide shows you one of the impacts, the direct impacts of climate change, and that is the effects of direct heat. And on the left you can see how the ability to work, particularly in tropical and subtropical regions, has estimated to have decreased by about 5% over the last 15, 16 years or so. So there's already been a perceptible change in the amount of labour that people can undertake, particularly those who can't work in air-conditioned environments. And on the right side of the slide, you can see how this will change as the temperature of the Earth warms. And you can see the yellow and dark red expands in its geographical reach as the temperature increases. And what this means is that this extreme level of heat is the level of heat which during the hottest month of the year it would be very difficult to work at all out of doors. So that will be immensely disruptive. You can see that by 1.5 degrees warming, which could occur within the next 3 decades or so, parts of the world becomes very difficult to work in the hottest month of the year, and labour capacity will be reduced in other months of the year. As we increase to 3 degrees, very large areas of the world, including here in Brazil, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, become affected, making it extremely difficult for people to undertake their normal economic activities, particularly in jobs which cannot be air-conditioned. So that could put well over 1 billion, perhaps 2 billion people at risk because of these very extreme heats exposure. And in parts of the world, there may be even such extreme heat exposure that there's a threat to survivability. So even for young, healthy people, it's difficult to keep their core body temperature within safe limits as the temperature of the Earth increases. We also know that climate and other environmental changes will affect and increase food insecurity in areas that are currently vulnerable to hunger and undernutrition. Many of these, of course, have contributed least to greenhouse gas emissions. The top part of the slide shows you where climate change could impact on the productivity of food crops, on the crop yields in decades to come. You see the red area is where there's going to be major decreases in crop yield in decades to come. And in the green areas, you can see that there may indeed be some increase in crop yield, crop growth in the temperate regions, but towards the latter part of the century, even that's in doubt. And it's very doubtful, for example, that increases in crop yield in the high latitude countries can necessarily counteract or offset the reductions in yield in low-income countries, because people will have to import food and they may not have the money to do so. We also know that after years of progress, hunger is on the rise, shown in the bottom part of the slide, which shows you the prevalence and number of undernourished people worldwide. And you can see that in the last year, 2016, for which we have data, there appears to be an increase. 38 million people face food insecurity, particularly in these 4 conflict-afflicted countries in Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan and Yemen. So climate change may not be the only factor, but it's probably one of the factors that's driving this. But it's not just the yield of crops or the amount of crops that we produce, it's also the nutrient quality of crops. So as the carbon dioxide goes up in the atmosphere, it does stimulate crop growth, but it reduces the nutrient concentration. This slide shows you how it reduces the level of protein in crops. It also reduces the level of important micronutrients like iron, which is Fe of course, and zinc, Zn. And so it will increase the number of people at risk of micronutrient deficiency around the world, particularly in low-income regions. We know that the food system also has wide-ranging impacts on the environment. It's a major producer of greenhouse gases. So the food system produces about 20 to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, depending on whether you include land use change or not. And you can see these are the sources of those greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide, but also methane, which is produced in rice fields, rice paddies, but also, of course, from ruminants like cattle. So increased demand from animal products is one of the contributing factors to climate change. It also makes major demands on water, and you can see how it's responsible for a large proportion of the global water withdrawals. Much of the irrigation, which depends on exploiting water in aquifers, which can't be replenished in human life scales, that is driven by increasing demands of agriculture. There's also soil degradation and erosion, and the kind of agriculture that we have is resulting in large-scale soil erosion in many parts of the world. And of course, again, soil cannot be replaced in the near future. And finally, of course, the food system is a major driver of land use change and habitat loss. And this slide just summarizes how it's affecting world biodiversity and how that's likely to evolve in decades to come. So the food system then is a major driver of the adverse impacts of the environment, as well as being susceptible to environmental change. And it's also driving a disease risk. So this slide shows you how many of the recently emerging infectious diseases in humans from wildlife are being driven by land use change, by changes in the food industry, changes in agricultural industry, which forces people and animals to come in closer conjunction, and therefore facilitates and makes easier the transmission of these diseases. And climate change and weather changes may also be playing a role in some of these disease outbreaks. So these are some of the challenges that humanity faces in this Anthropocene epoch, which is characterized, as I say, by this dominant role of one species, our species, and its impacts on the global landscape. So there are three things that our Commission said that we needed to tackle, three challenges. First is the imagination challenge. So the imagination challenge can be exemplified by the fact that we tend to use GDP as the main gross domestic product, or economic growth as the main indicator of human success. But of course, gross domestic product may not always translate into improvements in human welfare, particularly when humanity is already exploiting its resources and the planetary resources that we have to an unsustainable degree. So we need to think about other metrics perhaps linked to sustainable development or human health, that can replace some of these metrics of economic growth that may not sufficiently encompass many of the important determinants of human development. The second challenge is the challenge of knowledge generation. So we spend vast amounts of money on generating more biomedical knowledge, which is very important, but we spend very little on funding research which links human health and the environment. That is changing, but it's changing very slowly. So we still have far too little research in this area, this interface between global environmental change and human health. And finally, there's the implementation challenge. So even when we know what to do, we often don't do it. So for example, in the US, we're now seeing a reversal of some of the air pollution legislation under the new administration. So there are major implementation challenges which are partly in some respects related to the fact that very powerful interests are opposing change because it's not in their interest to move towards a more sustainable economy. So let me then give you a few of the benefits of moving towards a more sustainable economy. And there are potentially very major benefits from moving towards an economy which is not based on using carbon fuels or fossil fuels, but based on clean, renewable energy. This slide shows you the number of deaths that we could get if we could decarbonise the world economy, deaths as a result of reduced air pollution. It's from some recent work that we've been doing with our colleagues in Germany at the Max Planck Institute. You can see the top part of the slide shows you roughly 3.5 million deaths that could be prevented at today's population by decarbonising the economy, by taking fossil fuels out of the world economy because of the reduced air pollution. And the bottom part of the slide shows you that the number of deaths that we could prevent if we could essentially remove all anthropogenic sources of air pollution, about 5.6 million deaths a year. So very, very major health benefits. You can also see that some parts of the world, like Africa and parts of Latin America, the effects on fossil fuels are there, but they're not as much as some of the other effects, the other sectors, like the agricultural sector and like household energy, for example, which are also contributing to air pollution. So there are different sources in different parts of the world, and the two slides reflect that to some degree. So we need to move towards resource-wise or much more circular, what's called circular economies, which I'll explain in just a moment. And this is a vision of one city, it's a city in Finland, which sees itself over the next few decades moving to an economy which is based on renewable energy. So it's aiming to have zero CO2 emissions by mid-century, which is what we need in order to have a reasonable chance of getting to 2 degrees warming, as was agreed in Paris. Sustainable transport system, which is based on low carbon transport and active travel. Seeing waste as a resource rather than something that needs to be thrown away. There's a lot of valuable material in waste, and we don't exploit much of that valuable material in our current economy. In fact, only about 9% of our total economy is actually fully recycled and reused. So there's a long way to go in achieving a circular economy which minimises the amount of waste in our economy and throws as little as possible away. Healthy food grown as far as possible locally, emphasising plant-based diets which are both healthy and much lower environmental impact, and recycling water, using water as a valuable resource and using it sustainably, and focusing on developing sustainable communities which support local populations at the lowest possible level of environmental footprint. And remember, at the moment, if everyone on the planet lived like the average North American, we would need roughly 5 planets to sustain that economy. If they were to live like the average European, we would need about 3 planets to absorb all the pollutants, the greenhouse gases, and the waste that these populations produce. So we need to move towards a one-planet economy, and this is the vision of this particular city in Finland about how they propose to achieve that. Reducing food waste is going to be important, and promoting healthy, sustainable diets, because about 30% of the world's total agricultural land is used to produce food that's never eaten. And global food availability could also be boosted by about 70% if croplands were used to grow food directly for humans rather than for animal feed or biofuels. It may not be feasible, of course, to transform diets to vegetarian or vegan diets, although there are big dietary changes occurring in many parts of the world. But certainly we need to emphasise the benefits of higher consumption of fruit and vegetables in reducing non-communicable diseases like heart disease, stroke, and some types of cancer. And as can be seen on this slide, this would also reduce greenhouse gas emissions, land use, and water use quite substantially. So then we need to move towards this healthy circular economy vision in which we minimise the extraction of raw materials, we design goods for long lives, for remanufacturing, we reuse materials as much as possible, we repair them, and we reduce residual waste by maximising recycling. And if we do that in a way which takes into account the importance of protecting human health, for example by reducing exposure to hazardous substances, then we can greatly reduce our environmental footprint at the same time as improving human health. Finally, we also need to move towards a much more environmentally and socially sustainable health system. The health system is an important contributor to greenhouse gases in many countries. In the US, it's probably about 10% of emissions, and also has a big environmental footprint. So, for example, providing care closer to home, increasing resilience of the health system to those environmental changes that we can't prevent, like floods, heat waves, and disease outbreaks, reducing healthcare vehicle emissions, encouraging the use of public transportation, walking and cycling, and promoting healthy, low-impact diets amongst our patients are all important goals. And the bottom photo just shows you what a modern healthcare facility might look like. On the left, you can see the old hospital. It's the Children's Hospital in Liverpool. You can see that it had a very large car parking area. It took up a large amount of land, and next to it was a public park. The right side of the slide, you can see how this hospital has been transformed. It's been transformed by including the design ideas of children themselves. It's a children's hospital after all, so it's incorporated many of their suggestions. The hospital is now hardly visible because it's actually buried under the land. You can see that it's released an enormous amount of land for a community park. It is a very energy efficient hospital because it has a lot of insulation, including a green roof, so the amount of energy required is much lower, and it is much more efficient about delivering its basic services at a much lower level of energy requirements, and has released a lot of land for community ownership for a community park, as you can see. So this is an example of a healthcare facility of the future. And this slide just shows you for the UK National Health Service what the main causes of our greenhouse gas emissions are, the carbon footprint of our national health system. You can see that, surprisingly, energy from buildings is an important contributor, about 15%, but there are also other major contributors, and one of them is procurement. So a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions are locked into the products that the healthcare system uses, like pharmaceuticals, like the equipment that we buy. So procuring green products that are much lower energy input, working with the pharmaceutical industry and the equipment industry to reduce their carbon footprint is also a very important part of reducing the greenhouse gas and other environmental footprints of the health system. So finally then, what are the roles of healthcare professionals? This slide just summarises some points that we made in a recent short article in Lancet Planetary Health with a number of colleagues, Enrique Barros and Ayrton Stein, who are with you at your conference, so you can ask them more about it. But what we tried to do was to summarise the kind of impacts that health professionals could have on reducing the environmental footprint of health systems. So we defined activities in the healthcare system around prevention and health protection, in research and education, studying and educating about low carbon healthy strategies, policies and lifestyles, being responsible advocates for a more sustainable health system and more sustainable lifestyles, and also health systems strengthening to create more resilient health systems that can withstand some of the environmental impacts that we cannot prevent. And we made the case that through doing so we could help to promote a much more sustainable society, living at much lower levels of environmental impact, but also could help our patients and the broader population to adapt to the environmental changes that are even now happening and are going to get worse over coming decades. So in conclusion then, we do face very major challenges within the Anthropocene epoch over the coming decades. The remainder of this century obviously will see considerable advances, but we'll also see major threats and challenges to human health. But I've tried to emphasize that solutions do lie within reach. And one of the implications that we need to base those solutions on the redefinition of prosperity, to focus on the enhancement of quality of life, the delivery of improved health for all, together with the respect for the integrity of natural systems. And health needs to be placed at the centre of sustainable development, as illustrated by this slide of the Sustainable Development Goals. There's one Sustainable Development Goal for health, which is SDG 3, But health is actually influenced by many of the Sustainable Development Goals on poverty, which is 1, agriculture and sustainable food, which is 2, sustainable energy, which is 7, sustainable cities, which is 11, and 13, of course, which is climate change. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening.